we have everybody? I guess, yes. So he has put on the live YouTube, which I presume means we are getting streamed.
Right,
so
sir.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So let me then start. Okay. Hello, everyone, and good morning. My name is Deepak Mishra. I'm the Director and Chief Executive of ICRIER, the organization that is hosting this event. It gives me great pleasure in welcoming you all to the webinar on India's options and strategies for COP26 negotiations. The discourse around climate change has rapidly evolved in the last few years. Even a decade ago, climate change seemed like a distant topic specialized by a few climate scientists and environment economists. And for an average Indian, the predominant view was that this is a problem created by the rich world, and it is they who should solve it. This view also shaped India's strategy at global climate negotiations. But things are changing. Climate change is no longer seen as a future problem. It is a now problem. Dubbed a code red for humanity by the UN Secretary General, the latest IPCC report documents in far greater detail and with higher certainty the previous assessments on climate change and extreme events can be attributed to buildup of anthropogenic high greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. Not surprisingly, the world is eagerly awaiting the outcome of the Glasgow summit, which starts in 2 days. The world is talking about decarbonization, carbon pricing, climate equity and justice, net zero emissions, carbon neutrality, climate finance. And none of these phrases appeared in my graduate textbook even as late as late 1990s. And I should mention in passing that our climate change team at ICRIER has been busy writing about these issues for more than a decade. And we too are celebrating the Glasgow event through our blog Faced on Climate Change, which can be found on the ICRIER website. To its credit, India has been highly responsible in its policies and pronouncement when it comes to climate change. India's nationally determined commitments have been very ambitious, and we are on track to meet those commitments. India has been in a leadership role when it comes to renewable energy, committing to make Indian Railways net zero emitter by 2030, which is just one of the many examples, and so on. But while other countries, despite weak commitment in the past, have made ambitious announcements, India, with its strong track record of achievements, has shied away from changing its negotiating stance. I must say, and more as an outsider to this debate, that there are very few Indian economists and climate scientists I have met who are willing to go beyond disputing facts to asking the question, is it time for India to reconsider its traditional negotiating positions on climate change? And one of those economists and policymakers who is trying to break out of this mold is Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Montek and his co-author, Mr. Utkarsh Patel, are the authors of the paper we are about to discuss today, Getting to Net Zero, an Approach for India at COP26. And we have two very distinguished discussants, Mr. Manjeev Puri and Dr. Ajay Shah, to critically review and comment on the paper. So the webinar will be organized as follows. We'll have about 90 minutes total, out of which the first 30 minutes will be presentation by Montek, followed by 8 to 10 minutes intervention by each of our distinguished discussants. Then we'll open it up for Q&A, where both all the three panelists and Utkarsh will try to respond to your questions and comments. So keep sending me your questions through the chat box as and when they come to your mind. And finally, we'll turn to our very own colleague, Dr. Amrita Goldar, who will summarize the discussion and give vote of thanks. So I'll introduce the speakers as they start to speak. So let me begin with Montek, who will be the first speakers. And I think he needs no introduction, but as the chair, I will do my job. Montek is one of the finest economists and civil servants of our time and an inspiration to many of us, including me. He left an illustrious career at the World Bank and joined the government of India in 1979, as the economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance, after which he held a series of positions, including Secretary to the Prime Minister, Special Secretary to the Prime Minister, Commerce Secretary, Secretary in the Department of Economic Affairs, Finance Secretary, Member of Planning Commission, and Member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. The last position he held before he left the government was the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. Montek graduated from Delhi School of Delhi University and holds an MA and an MPhil in economics from Oxford University. For his outstanding contribution to economic policy and public service, Montek was conferred the prestigious Padma Vibhushan in 2011. It's a real pleasure and honor to have Montek as the speaker for this event. Montek, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deepak. You described me as the speaker, but I'm going to call on my colleague Utkarsh to also do a little bit of the speaking. So he and I work together on this. You know, you said we are giving us half an hour, and I'm hoping that I'll actually take a little less time. So let me make a few broad comments, which hopefully will give people a sense of where we come out of. As you say, this is a hugely complex subject, but we're looking at it from a very narrow perspective, which is what should be our strategy in COP26. And you know, in the last 2 or 3 years, there's a huge buzz that has built up on the net zero 2050, and we have not been, to my knowledge, supportive of it, and I think there are good reasons for that. But at the same time, both Utkarsh and I feel that we need to go beyond our traditional approach. I mean, our traditional approach has been that, look, you cause the problem, you fix it. We didn't cause almost any of the problem. We must be allowed to do what we like. And anyway, our development objectives, which cannot really be questioned, do call for more energy, and that involves more emissions. So we can't accept any reduction in emissions. That's fine, I mean, when it started. But what the climate change report, the most recent one, says is that time is now running out. And basically the world, if you take it as a whole, ought to plan to get to net zero by 2050. I don't question that. So the question really is, what should be India's strategy? So we have made a couple of points on that strategy. Point number one is that even if you accept the proposition that the world as a whole should go to net zero, that does not mean that everybody should go to net zero. And certainly poorer countries and countries that have very low per capita emissions like India don't have to go to net zero by 2050. On the other hand, we should accept the fact that we cannot just keep emitting without limit. So we need to accept that there has to be a trajectory of reduction. Emissions may actually rise in India and then go down and reach net zero sometime after 2050. And the global balance can be ensured by the developed world getting there well before 2050. Actually, the most recent IPCC report, according to Utkarsh, they've shifted 2050 to 2055 anyway, because of the constant change in data and so on. So our view would be that you have to have some sense of fairness. And I think on no sense of fairness can you come to the conclusion that India and the other big emitters should all reach 2050, net zero by 2050 together. Now, this is, I think, best illustrated by a graph, which we didn't have in the original paper, but we are going to insert. So let me ask Manjeev to put the graph up, and then Utkarsh will explain to you the unfairness in that graph. See, this graph basically starts from 2019, the levels of emissions for the US, Europe, India, and the rest of the world. India is the one in green, and sort of says, look, mechanically, if we all go down to net zero by 2049, what happens? Now, let me ask Utkarsh to outline what happens and why it's unfair. Utkarsh, please take over.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So if everyone has a common net zero date, And if they start with their current level of emissions, then if we assume that they decline linearly, then the prospective cumulative emissions that occur between now and 2050 would be proportional to the current level of emissions, because everyone had the same base between 2020 to 2050. Everyone has to get to net zero. Now, this is technically called as inertia, and this is inequitable because the ones at a higher absolute level of emissions would get a larger share of cumulative prospective emissions to emit. And those which are already at a lower level of emissions continue to be low. And that may object to various other development imperatives that one may have.
I think the last row in the table underneath highlights this point, because India, with 18% of the world's population, would get 6% of the remaining emissions. China, with 19% of the world's population, this is based in 2019, where they were a little bit bigger than us, would actually get 24%. So more than their proportional increase. US, with only 4%, would get 12% of the remaining emissions, and Europe, with 7% of the population, would actually get 8%. The rest of the world is roughly in balance, 53% of the population, and they get 50% of the emissions. But of course, for individual countries, it will change a lot. Now, it's not surprising why the US favors this, because in terms of the fairness of the allocation, if you like, it is most favorable for the United States. But it's clearly not favorable for India, nor by any stretch of the imagination could anyone say that even if we forget about historical emissions, remember, we're not talking now about historical, we just say what's a fair distribution of the emissions that are left, it would be very difficult to say that a fair distribution is that India, with 18% of the world's population, very low emissions, low income, etc., should only get 6% of what is remaining. And that's why we think the end date of 2050 should just be rejected. In our view, the important thing is not the end date anyway, because we've made an assumption about linear decline. You could have a 2050 with a convex decline, which would be much worse. In fact, the total budget might be bust, even though everybody gets to net zero by 2050. So what we have suggested is that each country should put forward what it regards as its emissions trajectory consistent with its development objectives, okay? And this should go then to the COP, and frankly, the IPCC should be asked to add them all up and tell us what does this do for global emissions? Because it's not just the end zero, it's the trajectory that's relevant. For example, China starts very high, and it matters what kind of trajectory China accepts. So our first point is shift the focus away from target dates, adopt an approach which is trajectory based, and accept the fact that developed countries must reach net zero much before 2050, and developing countries can get there later. Now, Germany has already said they will get there 2045. Whether that's enough or not, we have to say. Europe is actually doing not too badly. It's the US that really needs to do much more dramatic changes. And I think the president has landed probably in Italy by now. And all I read in the press is that he hasn't yet been able to get everything that he wanted on his own climate mitigation objectives. So there's a problem there. So that's our first point, that we should change. Now, the question will come up that, is this a departure in our policy? Absolutely yes, because so far we have said, look, we can't accept any reduction commitment in emissions. I mean, the commitment we made, which we keep talking about, is that the emissions intensity of GDP between 2005 and 2030, which is about 25 years, will be reduced by 35%. But since GDP between 2005 and 2030, which is 25 years, might be something like 4 times higher or 3.5 times higher. A 35% reduction in emissions will actually mean an increase in the total level of emissions. So we now have to work out is it feasible for us to actually go, if not now or even very soon, but certainly ultimately to zero. And here we have reviewed the existing literature. And our key point is that our traditional approach that development involves emissions is no longer valid, because technology has changed in a way that allows renewable energy to be used to provide energy. And also the form of energy to be used becomes electricity rather than fossil fuels. Now, the best example of this is in transport. I mean, you don't use petrol and diesel, you electrify the vehicles, so you just use electricity, and you produce the electricity through renewable means. It's not so simple in industry, because most of industry uses electricity except in areas that involve high heat. But those are not very easily substitutable at the moment. But we're talking about a 50-year, 30+ year transition, and technology suggests that we will actually get access to hydrogen at relatively lower costs. I mean, Mukesh Ambani has announced that they will go for reducing the cost of hydrogen from $6 per kg to $1 per kg. And even if he's remotely successful in that, that'll make a difference. So the ability to green our use of energy is already there as far as solar and wind is concerned, and is going to increasingly be there if hydrogen also comes in. I should add, by the way, that when we talk about solar and wind, there's a lot of discussion on whether in India on whether this is actually feasible. There's no question that one issue you have to consider is the cost of dealing with intermittency, in the sense that since renewable energy comes in an intermittent form, you need something, for example, battery storage, to even out the supply, and you have to add the cost of that battery storage. Now, the paper goes into these things, and our conclusion is that battery storage costs are also falling. So including battery storage, renewables will actually be very competitive. That's undoubtedly true for the expansion of electricity. But I think we can expand that also by saying that, look, there's a good chance for us getting rid of coal-fired electricity faster than the normal life of these plants. I mean, the simplest thing is no new thermal power plant other than those that are under construction. I think this is relatively easy. But I think more than that, you have a lot of power plants that are highly inefficient and also highly polluting. And you should take some cognizance of the pollution content. So it makes sense for us to accelerate the retirement of these plants, so that we should offer, in our view, not only a trajectory for the total emissions decline, but a shorter term trajectory of graduating out of coal. This is going to be a big issue because this is something which the Chinese have to do, other countries also have to do, and the United States has to do. Now, we cannot, I think, credibly say everybody else does something, but we do nothing. So we should work out what is it that is possible for us to do. And we suggest, based on what we've studied, I should emphasize, by the way, that we are relying, a lot of our secondary work. It's not that we've done the original work, a lot of work done in other institutions, notably the Council for Energy, Environment and Water, which have gone into this, and there are other institutions working on it. It does suggest that we can prematurely retire some of the older, more inefficient plants, so that our offer could be both a trajectory for total emissions reduction and also a trajectory for phasing out of coal. Now, I won't go into these issues, but while it sounds nice to say this, the truth is this will involve terrific structural change in the sources of energy, moving away from coal. I mean, in the longer run, we must be able to get up and say that coal production will decline from the present level to whatever it is. We are very proud of and happy to say that renewable energy will expand. Well, we're not ever saying that coal production will decline. That's understandable. I mean, politicians would not like to make a clear statement to this effect, but we have to recognize that if the energy transition leads to a shift from coal to renewable power, there'll be a lot more of this in the south based on wind, in the west based on solar, much more employment also, but correspondingly a loss of employment and also revenues in the coal producing states, which are poorer states. But if this transition is to take place over 30 years, we can reflect all this in our internal revenue transferring mechanisms by having compensation schemes, etc. But that has to be worked out. Similarly in electricity. I mean, if you want to really save, then basically we should be aiming for 100% electric fleet for whatever can be electrified, something by, say, 2050. Now, our corporates are very proud of the fact that they are starting to electrify. But at the moment, electric vehicle sale is 2% of the total. That's wonderful. I mean, at least we've got some electric vehicle sales going. But they should get a very clear signal that, listen, this is terrific, but the name of the game is that maybe 100% should become electric by 2035, which would be necessary if 100% of the fleet is to become electric by 2050. I mean, assuming that by then, the average life of a vehicle on the road will be down to about 15 years. It could be even less. But that's a very big transition. And for example, I think that this is not going to happen just by technology. It should be led by statutory action. I mean, there's nothing wrong with us passing a law which says that from 2035 or whatever date it is onward, it will not be possible to sell an internal combustion engine car in India. And if you say that now, then you're giving the industry 15 years to adjust. Now, my guess is that some of them will adjust and one or two fellows won't. But even if some of them adjust and the others start lobbying around 2035 that we need more time, we're in a stronger position to say no, because people have adjusted, and if you haven't adjusted, then you lose out. So there's a lot of, and there are lots of actions that we have to take in how we run electricity markets. We've talked a little bit about that. So actually, associated with the underlying energy transition is a big structural change. Now, my last point, and I'm still trying to keep it less than half an hour, I've only spoken so far, but I think about less than 20 minutes, is finance. You need to distinguish between the proposition that new energy is actually cost effective, and the proposition that you need finance. Because the old argument was that if it's not cost effective, then we have to be subsidized. The name of the game here isn't subsidy. The name of the game here is to correct market failures that prevent finance from going into this area, even though the energy actually being produced is cost effective. And the central problem here is the distribution system. The present system of distribution remains grounded in massive subsidy of losses at the distribution end. Unless that changes, the mere fact that you have electricity which is being produced competitively will not ensure that private sector will set up plants. And this is a critical thing. I don't think anyone thinks that government investment is going to provide the investment needed for this expanded energy. It has to be private investment. If it's private investment, then we have to get rid of these losses. And by the way, this is necessary whether we make the change or not, because I don't think in future people are going to set up power plants based on coal if they begin to have doubts whether they'll be paid, because the distribution companies are making huge losses. Now, this is getting very far from the world of climate change, but it's actually central to it, because if we don't solve this problem, we will not be able to handle the rest. So what I'm saying is that to make the change we're talking about requires a lot of investment. I mean, there are estimates by the IPCC that developing countries need $600 billion a year, all developing countries. India needs 150 billion. There are other estimates which are even larger. But the point really is, we should be very clear, this investment is not going to come by financial assistance. Most of it will have to come from our public and private sector. Some of it will come from international private sector if the system is made financially viable, but some part of it can come from both bilateral and multilateral funding. And this bilateral and multilateral funding can act in a way in which it actually becomes a stimulus for private flows because it deals with the problem of risk mitigation. Now, there are lots of detail there, and no one better than Ajay to comment on that, so I won't go into it. But we envisage, we're making, I think, a mistake by going on and on about the $100 billion. That was clearly promised. The West has clearly failed. We should certainly make the point that you fellows have got no credibility. But please don't make the mistake of thinking that credible promises to reach 100 billion make a jot of difference. That 100 billion was promised in 2009 when we had no idea. Nobody had any idea how much change was necessary. What is now necessary requires multilateral and bilateral finance on a whole different scale. Now, one other side of the coin is that these countries are spending a lot of money in helping the economy revive from the pandemic and so on. So the money that, I mean, for example, Nicholas Stern and Amar Bhattacharya have said that the aim should be to double bilateral financing for the new energy infrastructure, and secondly, to triple multilateral financing lending for the new energy infrastructure, and then deal with how you handle the increase in capital required for these institutions. So it's very important that we use these negotiations to get a sensible global compact. This is all the more reason why we should actually offer a trajectory. I mean, the idea of saying we can't offer anything, but you give us money, it just doesn't carry any credibility. So what we ought to do, I think, and Utkarsh thinks, we should offer as our contribution to the global transition, a credible trajectory as part of a global compact where everyone else does what is necessary and where a sufficient contribution is assured through multilateral financing. Now, actually, in mechanical terms, as and when these offers are made specific, it will be the next COP that will be told by the IPC what all this adds up to. At that point, my guess is that we will be busting the budget. So somebody will have to make up their mind who is to do more than what they're promising. And I think in that decision of who has to do more, fairness has to be a very critical thing. And then, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have criteria for fairness, but whatever it is, let's have a proper discussion on these things. But that, I think I can stop there. That's why what we have suggested is that we should break from our traditional stand, take a new stand, and keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Montek, and thank you, Utkarsh. That was a very nice exposition and set the stage very well for the rest of the discussion.
One thing, can we show, since I've taken less time, can you show
please.
that little video?
Yes, that will be wonderful, actually. Rajkumarji, can you put the video on if it is possible now? It's worth the wait, so people can wait for a few seconds.
I think this video was prepared by UNDP, and it kind of summarizes everything. It tells you, it conveys a lot in about 2 minutes, much more than I could do.
okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct? In 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm sure the UNDP folks will be happy that we are showing their nice video in our session. So Montek, I think it was a wonderful exposition of the issues, and I think you ended with a more constructive way to put it, saying, you know, what India should be doing is to put out a credible trajectory as a part of a global compact. And I guess you, in your presentation, you also mentioned the fact that this should be a conditional, or at least there should be a discussion on technology transfer and climate finance and other issues, but that's the way. And you also made some really interesting comments, which I hope Mr. Puri and Dr. Shah will touch on, in terms of no new thermal power plant, or prematurely retiring inefficient ones, the big structural changes, the whole issue on electricity being a huge part of the center of this discussion. I think these are terrific ideas, and I know some of them are already working on this issue. So let me first turn to Mr. Puri. So Manjeev Singh Puri joined, I'm reading out his CV here, joined the International Foreign Service in 1982 and has served as ambassador of India to more countries than you can count on your fingertips. So I'm not going to mention all of them. Major areas of his experience and professional focus relate to the environment, in particular climate change and sustainable development. He was the lead negotiator for India at UN on issues relating to the post-2015 development agenda, sustainable development goals, and at the UN Conference on Sustainable Development held in Rio, Brazil in June 2012. He was a key member of India's delegation in various climate change negotiations, including the Conference of Paris of UNFCCC, in Copenhagen in December 2009, and before that in Montreal, Bali, Bonn, and Boston. Manjeev has a master's degree in management and did his BA honors in economics from St. Stephen College in Delhi. He's a distinguished fellow and on the advisory board of TERI. I can't think of somebody more qualified and with the expertise that he has to be a commentator for this session. So let me now turn to Mr. Puri.
Deepak, thank you very much. And first of all, let me thank you personally, and let me say welcome to Delhi and to heading ICRIER, Deepak. We are all very delighted that you are here. Thank you very much for inviting me at a session which is being anchored by someone that I, in the course of my life, has always looked up to as a major change agent in India. And I'm referring to Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Utkarsh, if you don't mind my acknowledging this. I've known him, of course, familiarly and otherwise for a long time. Now, I have only 10 minutes, and I'm very happy to take different questions. You know, I liked some of the ideas which he espoused all throughout his life, think out of the box. And I do think that in the context of the international negotiations, You should think out of the box. Remember where you are going and what is the game. Deepak, let me make a point to you. If the results in the United States in November 2020, exactly a year back, had been different, we may not even been having this webinar. So much so for what facts are. Secondly, Dr. Ahluwalia himself mentioned what is happening in the United States. This is a country where under both Democrat and Republican administrations, they reneged on climate agreements which they signed themselves. And even today, what is the state of play? Do you think any domestic action will take place? I don't think so. That is why all the issue that you take international action. That is why the graph that was shown is very appealing to them. That is why the objective here is not net zero for the world by 2050, but net zero every country to sign up, which is why the G20 becomes a very important element. What is happening? It's the last place at push and pull that will take place. I think everyone here needs to understand that these negotiations, if they were purely environmental or even energy, they would have been conducted differently. And Dr. Ahluwalia, please allow me to say, if we could leave it all to the IPCC, which is an intensely political body. I don't know if you recall, but one of your esteemed officers was complained against by one of our own people who headed the IPCC when he raised the perspectives of India. These are facts. I can relate a whole lot of these sort of stories, having been through the negotiation process and the pulls and pressure. I don't know what the government of India's stance will be. Indeed, the Honorable Minister said we are keeping some things up our sleeve. So what should I say about that? That is entirely for the government to decide, because there are a large number of pulls and pressures on what is happening. But I think we should understand a very simple thing. The COVID pandemic, which hit everyone and where there were immediate actionable points. What is the state of play? A large part of the world has had no vaccinations. And has the UN made any such video about it? You and I, you worked in the World Bank, I've worked in the UN a lot. We know what happens. We know these are games that countries play. So let us remember one thing. These negotiations are part of the same milieu that has been going on for decades, if not centuries. Global power play and global power game. And let's not kid ourselves into thinking it's anything. What we do domestically is for us to do. And I, at least one, believe very strongly that the policy space for domestic action should be as much as possible for your government. Let's learn from the United States in the way it sort of goes about. We use them as role models for everything, but please try and look at what policy space means. So I just want to leave this one particular thought. I think it's very important. I'm glad that there is general agreement that for India, 2050 net zero is willy-nilly impossible. It would be a hell of a lot of action. In fact, they are mentioning their paper, various things. Let me tell you, a paper that Dr. Montek Ahluwalia also quoted favorably was a study done by TERI several months back. And this study aimed to look at the energy sector if we could reach net zero by 2050. And what did we say? Lots of things were possible. Huge jacking up of electricity, and more than that, its production through solar and wind, i.e. non-fossil fuel. Incidentally, in the United States today, 60% of electricity comes from fossil fuel. I keep saying these points because, in India, people tend to forget what are the ground realities of why the other guys take other positions. And then what did the TERI study point out? Let me say this. India's emissions, business as usual, in 2050 would be about 6 gigatons. With all these actions, 1.3 gigatons would remain unabated. And to tackle them, you would have to do forestation in an area of the size of Rajasthan, by the way. So this is with using all these new technologies and being gung-ho about them. Carbon capture and storage, 20 years back when I was Joint Secretary here, along with the United States, I served on a clean technology board, India, US, Japan, Australia, and others. A US company called Southern Power was in charge of this project. The CEO was sacked a few years later. These technologies must come to a degree of maturity. I'm happy that Indian corporates are signing up in a big way. But, we have never been great global leaders. And I don't want to get into all that. I don't want to stay out of all Let these technologies come to fruition. I have no doubt that India will be one of the largest employers of these technologies. They will. Really not making any effort in the last 4 years. Even funding for clean energy innovation in the United States never happened in any of the major labs. I mean, recognition of all of this is particularly important. Let me say something about costs also. These are just to save points. This TERI study did not mention anything about costs, but we ran it through the old Markle model. And it said that you would require about $3 trillion over this period, roughly about 3% of India's GDP to get over the hump. Now, this used a discount rate of 10%. If we followed Nicholas Stern, who, by the way, even I know fairly well, if we used his model of no discounting, you know what the figure goes up to? $113 trillion, 28% of India's cumulative GDP. Now, I'm not trying to scare anyone. These are all governmental decisions, and decisions will have to be taken. And I am convinced in my mind that in India, we will be taking some of the world's largest climate actions and billing them so. In the years to come, I have no doubt we will embark on hydrogen, electrification, electric vehicles, all we will do. All I'm saying is strategy for international negotiation. Please remember, who are the demandeurs? The demandeurs are the West. What have they done? Precious little, especially the largest of the demandeurs. And what is it that they want to do? Basically shift the burden. And you know it, we all know it. I'm very wary when it comes to negotiating tactics to offer segues to others. In fact, I would say a very simple thing. This is not my personal view, but purely from a hard negotiating perspective. If you say no to move things, they will have to do some compromises. In fact, agree for you to have some space for your development. Otherwise, believe me, you start offering things such as trajectories going down, etc. They will be very straight away interpreted that you will agree to a downward hill thing. And incidentally, it isn't just a matter that I agree to do something in 2050 and my grandchildren will come and answer the question. There will be, if not yearly, every 5 years, reviews, and these reviews will become more stringent and you will be focused on those. What kind of a country is India? India is neither the United States, which can renege on commitments. India is neither Russia, which can show two thumbs, or China, which just looks the other way. India actually is wedded to multilateralism. We as a civil society, we as a judicial system, we as governments actually start taking these commitments seriously, which means we must be quite, let me say, circumspect. As I said, what the government does, it's for the government to take a decision. They have so many other factors to take into account, geopolitics, what would be the nature of global reaction, etc. But frankly speaking, if you look at it purely from this, our development perspectives mean that our emissions have to rise given the technologies. Can we peak by 2050? Everyone's agreeing that can we come down to net zero by 2050? Everyone's agreeing no. In which case, in terms of the negotiation, let's not throw baits or anything. We are in no position to do that. We would become the bait by ourselves. Negotiations need to be hard, and we need to stick to that. I can take Dr. Ahluwalia back to Copenhagen. Believe me, if we and our cohort was not strong, you would have been taken to the cleaners much earlier. And I am using this expression mostly to, energize a more energetic kind of thinking. I mean, obviously, for a country of India's size, that isn't going to happen to anyone. We are in a position to resist and so on, whether we become the largest country and still may remain poor. Let's also remember this. Our development imperatives are pretty clear. I think Dr. Ahluwalia, before we started, mentioned this fact. We're the only G20 country with a per capita income of less than $2. Let's not use this purchasing power parity business. Let's talk about real business. This is a game of power play. There's nothing else to it. If India becomes a $5 trillion economy, and let's look at the larger projection. By the year 2050, most projections say among the 3 largest economies in the world, there will be India. And we might just be the 2nd largest economy. So just let's understand all of this. This doesn't mean that you do rampant action, hell with the planet. Not at all. You take all of that. But please ensure that the international negotiation don't result in crimping of policy space. What we do ourselves is really for our own decision making and our own way of looking at all of this. Let me stop now. I think I have taken my 10 minutes. I have also evoked a few smiles from various people, some nodding their heads, some looking the other way. But the idea actually, Amrita, thank you very much. The idea actually was to say that, look, change is not a great idea just for the sake of change. And it doesn't necessarily get you. Focus on exactly what you want. The headline in the Hindustan Times to Dr. Ahluwalia and Utkarsh's article was, for a meaningful COP, I would just amend it for a very simple thing, for a meaningful COP for India. Thank you.
Okay, that was very good. I think you brought a lot more energy to this discussion. I think if I can summarize, you are saying, which is, I guess, a lot of people would say, which is that I think India should continue to do what it should do in its interest, but create enough space so that the international negotiation doesn't constrain us from doing whatever we want from the growth and prosperity perspective. So I think it's a majority view, I guess, and I can understand why you're getting so many nods and thumbs up on the thing. But I think what Montek is doing is, I mean, is that the issue that actually is ultimately, in the kind of India's global interest. But that's a kind of a nice segue to bring Ajay here, who also had an op-ed few days back. And let's see where Ajay comes out on this debate on this. And I'm very excited to have Ajay here. Ajay studied at IIT Bombay and at USA Los Angeles. He held positions in the CMI, IGIDR, Department of Economic Affairs and Ministry of Finance, and at NIPFP. He is now part of the ex-KDR Forum and Jindal Global University. His research is at the intersection of economics, law, and public administration, something we actually need in a debate like this. His second book, co-authored with Mr. Vijay Kelkar, In Service of the Republic, The Art and Science of Economic Policy, featured in Bloomberg's Global 2020 Best Books on Business and Leadership. Thank you, Ajay, for joining us. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Deepak. I'm happy to be here. It was great listening to Montek and Utkarsh and Manjeev, and I'm just going to incrementally indulge in some thoughts that were triggered in my mind out of listening to these. I think I want to say 5 things. Okay, the first thing I want to emphasize is that the world is in a truly new place here. The countries of the world have never done a complex collaborative project like this before. So let me compare and contrast with trade negotiations. We're all used to WTO. We whine about WTO being an ineffective process. In that, I would also emphasize that WTO is a remarkable incentive problem because there is a bedrock of trade theory which teaches us that the basic self-interest of every country is to do unilateral trade liberalization. So it's like a reverse free rider problem. Fundamentally, what is good for me as India is to not do protectionism. Fundamentally, what is good for me as India is to unilaterally open up the borders. We put up a big show like WTO because we would like to get Sri Lanka to also liberalize. But what we are trying to do is go with the grain of the fundamental self-interest of every country. In contrast, in the carbon dioxide problem, we have a fundamental problem, which is that everybody has a free rider problem. Everybody would like to emit while preventing other people from emitting. So this is a different problem. And if we think WTO was dysfunctional, this is 100x harder. Because in WTO, basically, it was one big show layered on top of a self-interest, which was unilateral trade liberalization. So, every economist understands the bedrock of trade theory is that it is efficient and wise for India to open up unilaterally. If, by the way, along the way, we can push some other people to open up as well, all the better. This is the first point, that the old playbooks don't predict how this story will play out. The world has never dealt with this problem before. There is no playbook. So we need to think differently. We need to think from scratch. Second, I feel that there is a tidal wave in this space, and my friend and co-author Akshay Jaitley has been emphasizing this to me. There is a tidal wave in this field, which is the views of the electorate of the first world. There's a recent Pew Research study which finds that 80% of the respondents in the first world answer yes to the question, that they believe that climate change is a problem and they believe that they're personally willing to change their lives in response to it. It's very hard to get 80% of the first world electorate to agree on anything. And this is the driver, because in liberal democracies, where 80% of the electorate goes, the hearts and minds of the lawmakers follow. And in that sense, climate change is a first order problem in the thinking of the democratic leadership of the first world countries. And in that, it will bubble into the world of international relations. This phenomenon has been greatly helped by Donald Trump. Okay, so I believe that Donald Trump should get a Nobel Prize for his contribution to climate change, because he helped galvanize everybody to move positions and move far more dramatically and push harder on solving these problems. And today, it seems to me that there is a great consensus, and the interests of the leadership of most of the first world are aligned, reflecting the consensus in the first world electorate. That this is a first order problem and we need to bring all levers to play, and all levers includes international relations. Now, India is in a particularly fragile position in terms of international relations. We've basically got an unpleasant situation with China. So the central story of everything we think about in international relations has to be how we think of forming coalitions of like-minded countries to support India and participate with India in checkmating China. It is striking that there was a Chinese invasion on the northern border of India, and not one country in the world moved one finger to help India in any material fashion. That's a comment on how isolated India is. Climate is going to become a bargaining chip in that larger Indian realpolitik. We should work for our own self-interest, and it will be impossible for India to ignore the materiality of climate change in the thinking of first world democracies, where the political leadership will have to respond to the views of the electorate. My third argument is that India's position is potentially a bit better than meets the eye. Montek and Utkarsh correctly point to the sea change in the economics that has taken place, because on an incremental basis now, renewables investments are actually cheaper than traditional coal-fired thermal plants. I want to push on that idea a little bit in a deeper extent. In the United States, the installed base of fossil fuel electricity generation per capita is much worse than what we see in India. In the United States, the installed base of inefficient personal transportation is much greater than what we have in India. So because we in India are a latecomer, we actually have a great asset, which is called malleability. So we have the ability to put things on a negotiating table, which is greater than double quotes our fair share, and this should be part of our negotiation. I also will point out parenthetically that the dollar value of destruction from the rising seas in New York is greater than the dollar value of that identical destruction in Bombay. Okay, so in all these ways, we actually have a unique opportunity that comes from being a poor country and a latecomer, and this should play in sophisticated development of bargaining positions on the part of India. So roughly speaking, we get more CO2 reductions per unit dollar in India than in the United States, if we think through this correctly. And that comes from malleability of the installed base of capital in India, as opposed to Los Angeles in the United States, where so much has been built out by way of infrastructure that it's really not possible to become energy efficient today. That's not the constraint that we see in India. My fourth point on finance is that too much of this discussion tends to think about intergovernmental flows. We think of some governments of the world sending money to the union government of India. And I think that's a less useful vision. I think resource flows have to happen at many levels. The brunt of the action on the electricity sector is at the state governments of India. So the resource flows have to go to states, not to the union. Similarly, cities have to do the stuff like I just described about Los Angeles, and the resource flows have to go to the cities. And all of us should be thinking much more of a decentralized model of India rather than some leadership in New Delhi that thinks for the whole country. The great phenomenon that is reshaping the thinking of private investors is ESG investments. It is already a huge phenomenon. You can no longer finance a coal-based thermal plant in India, not because the Indian government thought that this is industrial policy that we in India should follow, but because the global investment climate shifted and because investors in India respond to international asset pricing. So ESG investment is the giant pathway through which private capital flows are taking place. And that's great and that's important. And we should recognize and value these flows. We should not think just about money that comes into the coffers of the union government. And finally, we should think more about philanthropy. Global philanthropy is a very big and important phenomenon. And there is goodwill for India. India is loved and respected and trusted as a decent rule of law, liberal democracy. And there is interest on the part of global philanthropy in helping in India, particularly on climate adaptation. And that's a third pillar of the resource flows that can and should come to India. So our thinking on finance should be much bigger and more eclectic rather than thinking of the union government. We should think of state governments, we should think of city governments, we should think of ESG investments, we should think of philanthropy. Finally, my last warning to all of us is I just want to restate the obvious. Everybody in this room knows that the elephant in the room is state capacity constraints in India. We fare poorly in thinking, in devising strategy, in living up to strategy. We're weak on the intellectual stuff. We're weak in intra-India political negotiations, and we are weak in execution. We should count on mistakes. It's very humbling to weave mistakes as an integral part of our thought process of the next 30 years. And this is one important reason why there are difficulties in a centrally planned carbon transition. I think too many people in this game want to become a new planning commission where we will sit down and work out that there will be so much contribution by agriculture and there will be so much contribution by electricity, and by this year all cars will be electric and so on. I think that we should be humble and we should think that there are capacity constraints in the Indian state in doing any kind of central planning. So it's much better to have a market-led approach. We should just do large-scale carbon taxation and leave these adjustments to private people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay. That was very succinct and very nice. You build up the story very nicely, but I think you cleverly didn't get to the pronouncement on the debate. I think you mentioned about that India is in a fragile situation and it can't ignore the realities of the first world, and the reality of the first world is they, want to have a deal. And so in that context, what would India be doing in Glasgow? I think I'll come back to you at the Q&A, but it was terrific. So we've got lots of questions already in the chat box. I had several I had received even before the meeting. So let me first give priority to the colleagues who have sent questions on the chat box itself. I think the first thing I should say is there was one comment saying we need a combination of the two strategies that Montek and Manjeev set out. I don't know what is it, but there's some people trying to create a truce here, which is great. But let me read out a couple of questions which are, so first was, I think, on which, I think it says the current share of renewables in electricity production is only 8%, but then we want to go to 40% by 2030. Is it even possible? This is from Puri Thangarajan. If you don't mind, I'll read out one or two and then direct some of them to the right person, or if you want to volunteer for that. There's another question which is, what is the share of anthropogenic activities in climate change in composition to natural forces? Because this is a bit complicated, anybody on the environment team, including Amrita, could come in. So those are two, but there are 5 more I'll read out, but Does anyone want to take the question on renewables? Is it even technically feasible to reach 40% by 2030?
Can I ask Utkarsh to answer that? Utkarsh, will you please do that?
Yes, thank you, sir. So the two parts of that question. So our target is to reach 40% of the installed capacity by 2030. And we're saying that the new targets of having 450 gigawatts by the end of this decade would make it possible or probably overshoot that initial target. The 8% is the current electricity generation that's coming from renewables. And if we do not, if the capacity load factors of the coal power plants concomitantly come down as the renewables increase, we have more robust transmission infrastructure and storage capacity, as we discuss in the paper, that will be necessary for renewables. There are nuclear power plants coming in by 2031, and there's no scope to increase hydro, but from the rest that I just mentioned, it is technically feasible to reach there. Whether we'll reach there or not, it's a different question.
Yes, a lot depends on, as Ajay said, on state capacity and state policies. But can I also request if Montek, do you want to respond a bit? I should have done that first. Kind of your reaction to what Manjeev suggested in terms of creating this buffer between what you want to do domestically versus what you want to do in international negotiations.
Yeah, no, that's, Manjeev has much more experience than I do in negotiations, particularly in the UN type context. There's obviously a good cop, bad cop aspect to all negotiations. I'm really speaking, where I agree with what Manjeev has said completely, is that as far as our domestic policy is concerned, everything we do should be based on an appreciation of what is our domestic interest. And what we have suggested in our paper is precisely that, okay? One may question it, as some of the readers have. And what we are saying really is that if technology has changed, now Manjeev has raised some questions, has it changed, hasn't it changed? Neither he nor I know what it's going to be like over the next 30 years. But in my view, if Mukesh Ambani says he's going to set a target of $1 per kg for green hydrogen, I mean, he is likely to be around by the time this target is actually achieved, whereas most negotiators won't be there. They'll be doing something else. So I personally am very hopeful that we should not underplay the extent of technology change that is likely, okay? Manjeev also talked about how much afforestation we would need. That's a big problem there. But if you can't do it through afforestation, there is the technological possibility of carbon capture, use, and storage, which is actually not commercially viable right now. But please remember that we're looking at what needs to be done maybe 20 years from now. So think of where technology was on the internet and all the rest of it 20 years ago. I mean, look, 30 years ago, we didn't have email, more or less, okay? So everybody says that this is an area where there's going to be rapid change in technology. This happens to be exactly the area where it's not just us, it's the rest of the world is putting all their energy into getting the technology to work. I mean, precisely for the reasons that Manjeev said, that the United States is a horrendous fossil fuel user. I'm sure that within the United States, the UNDP video of the dinosaur will go around and be listened to by a lot of people. By the way, a couple of retired UN civil servants have commented that the UNDP video is an insult to the UN. So I view this as an internecine fight within the UN family and leave it to them. Personally, I didn't think it was an insult at all. I think the pressure within the US for people who have the new technology, can develop the new technology, to then fight the vested interests will grow. Of course, never underestimate vested interests. They play a very big role, but new vested interests arise. What we have said very clearly is Niti Aayog should be tasked with looking at all these multiple studies and telling us what is it that's feasible and also economically sensible? We are not suggesting, I mean, we've given a suggestion mainly to emphasize that 2050, we should actually persuade the world that 2050 for each country is simply not sensible or logical. That's what our paper says. I think Manjeev agrees with that. And for me, a big outcome from COP would be the debunking of the 2050. But the only way you can credibly debunk it is not by saying, I need all the policy space I can get in order to pollute. You can debunk it by saying, don't think I don't have a national target. This is my national target, which Niti Aayog can give us. My view is that when we do that, everybody will have a national target and it'll generate 50% more emissions than the world can take. That's when we have to sit down and decide who should reduce their emissions. And in my view, the chart that we showed will make it very clear that if the United States, with 4% of the population and all the technology at its command, cannot possibly expect to get 24% share of the remaining emissions. And you can have a national target, but if it's part of a conditional target, you're not committed to it unless the other fellows do something. Now, in my view, and I don't know if Manjeev will agree with this, one of the most damaging things in our negotiation strategy has been the experience with the WTO. Whereas, not WTO, GATT, where for many years we adopted the free rider approach. And look, you fellows are the big guys, you sort it out, don't ask us to do anything. And when we became bigger guys, they started asking us to do anything, but we said, no, special and differential, whatever treatment, don't ask us to do anything, you do what you like. That was bad. I mean, Jagdish Bhagwati has made the point that we helped to undermine the international multilateral trade negotiations by never being willing to step up as responsible partners. So what I'm saying is, let's have a trajectory. And if those guys, it will certainly turn out that everybody's trajectory is too big. That's when negotiations start. At that point, the good cops can walk out of the picture. And all the bad cops that Manjeev wants to bring to the negotiations can do so and do a best trade-off. I mean, trade-offs can be, look, I mean, if you're going to have to do this, you have to give us that much money, or you have to do even more. Remember, forcing the US to go net zero by, let us say, 2035 has immense benefits to us because it will develop the technologies on which we will ride to achieve our own energy efficiency and emissions reduction. That's when the negotiation becomes serious. But for us to say, don't ask me to do anything at all, you go to, it's just not having a discussion. I mean, then you're in the WTO world, then they'll just say, look, why don't you guys, we will think of sanctioning you and having some carbon taxes on your export. I don't think personally that that's the way to go. So one of your commentators said a combination of Mr. Ahluwalia and Ambassador Puri. And I'm suggesting the combination. Let's get a sensible national trajectory which persuades our people that we can actually reduce emissions, and then let Manjeev and his friends negotiate as best they can and do the Bad Cop Act in international negotiation. I think that's fine. That's a good combination in my view. I think I agree with most of what Ajay had said. The most important thing he said, which we kind of touch upon, but we didn't actually emphasize, is the role of carbon pricing. I totally agree with him, by the way. When I said Niti Aayog, I wasn't trying to convert them into the old planning commission and get them to say, thou shalt do this and thou shalt do that, but rather spell out kind of a scenario. I totally agree with Manjeev that the scenario is not going to be implemented because the government is going to do public sector investment or international aid is going to come. It's going to be implemented if the private sector responds. The biggest problem there is prices. He mentioned carbon taxes. I completely agree with him. The IMF, for example, has put forward, I think we mentioned this in the paper, that a way of doing climate justice would be for India to have a carbon tax of $15 per ton of CO2, for the Europeans for China to have $25 per ton of CO2, and for the US and Europe to have $50 per ton of CO2. Now, something of that kind, which is a differential tax that reflects the UNFCCC's ability to do things, I forget the exact phrase we use, would send very powerful signals. But domestically, I mean, we have to sell it. And in fact, I find that almost all the people who want to basically move to a sustainable energy strategy are not in favor of abolishing fossil fuel subsidies. That is what the dinosaur was going on and on about. So, we have to be clear. Are we also saying that because we are poor, we need fossil fuel subsidies? I would say no. We need subsidies. Give it direct income transfer, but don't, for God's sake, have any fossil fuel subsidy. My suggestion to you is in ICRIER, if you put this forward as a proposition and just find out how many people agree with that let us take it, and I don't say this as part of international negotiation. I think Ajay would also agree with this. This is part of sensible domestic policy. Let us not peddle ridiculous things like fossil fuel subsidies on the grounds that we are too poor, when most of these subsidies are benefiting those of us who are driving SUVs. Let us have a rational fuel pricing system and an appropriate income transfer to the poorest. Now, what the UID and the direct benefits transfer and the India stack and all these things have done, it is possible to identify the entitlement of each Indian for a subsidy to cover the higher price of fossil fuel and pay it out. Pay it out of the revenue you get from imposing the tax in the first place. So that is a national move. I'm sure it will be applauded globally, but whether any politician is willing to do it is another thing altogether. But you never know. I mean, I think the point is we're not having a debate on this. I don't want to comment on Manjeev's point that the United States is so untrustworthy that it's not worth negotiating with them at all. That may well be true, but I'll leave that to the negotiators to decide. I mean, I think we should focus on what do we want as a national strategy and then negotiate as best we can in the international forum. I think one point I want to make, and that is, I noticed in the chat, somebody said that, look, if you're worried about methane, isn't vegetarianism good? Absolutely right. There's no question about it. But the solution to that, I think, again, as Ajay would agree, is to have a tax on meat and not on vegetables. It makes a lot of sense to do that. And it's economically rational. People don't actually realize that if we go as non-vegetarian with rising incomes, as the rest of the world has, then the methane emissions, etc., will increase hugely. Now, you see, it's easier for me to say this because I've reached the age when I want to go vegetarian anyway. So, I mean, as people would say, maybe I should pay a tax based on all the historical meat that I've consumed in order to get equity. But this is an important point. We don't actually look at these things. Similar issues arise in other aspects of sustainability because water, I mean, other than energy, water is one of the most critical things, and there is no consensus in the country on pricing water. In fact, the consensus is that it should be free. The other thing is air, and pollution is the huge damage that is being caused, partly by fossil fuel vehicles, partly by fossil fuel burning to produce electricity. Once again, a carbon tax would facilitate the shift both to electric vehicles and to other things with immense benefit to people's health. Now, this is not a negotiation issue. This is a national strategy issue, and we should push it in that context.
Okay. Thank you very much, Montek. I must say that this has been a very interactive session where there's lots of questions on the chat box. So I do want to give Manjeev a chance to respond back, but if you don't mind, I'll just put a few more questions for you. I think some of the questions have been answered, but there are a couple of more which are really interesting. And one is the issue that, no major political party has ever made a perfunctory mention of environmental issues in the last election. nor are they ever expected to make for the upcoming one. So how do you really, I mean, do Indians really care about these issues? And if they are, why are this not showing up in a manifesto of a political party? So that, I think it'll be good to hear some of those things. I think there's a bit of a question about whether the electricity, can you go and do less thermal and no more new thermal? I think Utkarsh and Ajay have responded to that, but I saw, I think there's a response back saying, but I think NTPC is already planning several, CES study calls for more thermal plants, 34 gigawatt to be precise. This is ever and over what is already under construction. So clearly the government is thinking about building more thermal power plants. So I'd like, some response to that. There's a couple of questions on, can India be able to provide support to other South countries? I think it was, nobody has touched on this. If you want to touch on this. Of course, there are several comments about, should we be having one yardstick for all countries, as some of the UN reports have mentioned. Can we ever? So I think we have covered those grounds. So if some of the participants who had put this question, I hope you don't mind if I'm not putting up those. But let's talk a little bit about, our political, the connection between all the issues they're debating versus what our political parties in the manifesto are talking about. Second is the government policy still not recognizing the issues and there's still plan for a lot more thermal and coal investment. And third would be, can India do anything to help other developing countries? So who would like to go first? Can I ask Manjeev to go first? If you don't mind, 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak. Thank you very much. Look, I think India on its part is doing a fair amount. Look at the International Solar Alliance. It's an effort on our part to try and see what we can do to propagate solar power, its use, etc. Similarly, through our coalition on disaster resilient infrastructure, we are doing the same thing. We've been active on every one of these things, but I think the single biggest thing that we can do for the developing world is role model. If, for example, we do what we are doing on renewable energy, others will see that it is feasible and then they take it on. I am very clear in my mind. India would start adopting any of the technologies which the Western world has established and done. Let's take the case of this internet and the data and Geo and Airtel and all that. The moment it became established there, we became the largest customer. There is this issue about what happens. Are we in that leadership position? Look, I don't want to get into that. I think it's a little premature. Dr. Ahluwalia, sir, you mentioned many things. I think we, on various issues of national policy, we can't but be on the same page. I think we do agree. On the issue of coal, I think, there are some discussions that need to take place. But on international negotiation, you mentioned WTO. Sir, I can't agree with you that special and differentiated is a bad idea. China is the greatest example of having taken advantage of it. I mean, if you could not take advantage, it is because you could run your domestic policies well. But it gave you international space. This free rider business, it has come about as a result of the other fellows recognizing what is happening. And China as the great market was the opportunity seized by the United States. Can we put ourselves forward as the great market? If and when we are able to do that, that will be the crux of the change. So therefore, this business of common but differentiation, there's a very fundamental element. You're talking about this 100 billion. Sir, how did it come about? I think we need to understand that. And let me draw your attention to something. That paragraph in Copenhagen starts by saying that the developed world will provide $20 million, approaching $20 billion in the years up to $30 billion in the years up to 2020, and thereafter $100 billion. You know how the word approaching came about? This was part of the deal. And then at the last minute, President Obama got up and said, I can't agree to it. And he said that the reason is I don't have the power to sanction authorization. This is Congress's power. This is standards way the way governments negotiate. Let's understand that. And, I can't say it here on this, but, if he could have gone red, he did go red. And we have stuck with the word approaching. Let me make it very clear. India is not in this business of 100 billion. We will be outed from it altogether. we will be forced to go into the market, which is why sometime back we wrote that what we really need as a large developing country, India, is a kind of level playing field to be able to get into the international markets and raise money. Today, those markets are skewed against us. The taxonomies are skewed against us. That is the bottom line problem, which is why these, policy space implications are particularly important. A, to try and level the policy space on the international level such that we at least have a chance there, and B, so that we have the space to do what we want. That's really for political leadership to take a call. You said nobody mentioned it in their manifestos. Let me tell you, environment will become increasingly issues which are there. Will we have a green party? I don't think so. But what is the first thing that everybody mentions? Development. And what is it that the other guys don't mention? Development. You work with the bank has moved away from being a poverty alleviation tool to becoming a sustainable development move. A great thing to save the bank from oblivion, literally. The UNDP's previous boss, Helen Clark, used to always fight with me whether sustainability was the key thing or development was the key thing. It's the way you look at it, sir. It's where you come from. For me, it had to be development. If SDG's first goal continues to remain poverty alleviation, please give credit to all of us. If they would have had the way, the 13th goal would have become the first goal. I'm not saying the 13th goal is wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manjeev. That's wonderful. I know we are running out of time. So can I turn to Ajay for a quick 2-minute intervention? And finally, I'll turn to Montek.
Yeah. So I have an opinion on how this plays out. There are 3 sources of impulse upon the Indian system. The first impulse is that the geopolitical situation has changed. We are in a far more difficult and vulnerable situation vis-a-vis China. And India needs to do foreign policy at the level of quality of a small European country of the 20th century. This means reshaping domestic policy in ways that coalition partners find attractive. And the most important chip in that bargaining is going to be climate. The second pathway for change is the global ESG environment. There is no meaningful physical magnitudes in the Indian state as being a player, investor, operator of the Indian economy or the Indian energy system. The focus has to be on private investors. Private persons in India do not live in an autarkic financial system. Private investors now play in international asset pricing. They look at a cost of capital that is determined globally. In the ESG inflected world, that means nobody is going to build a coal thermal plant. The focus is on renewables. The focus of energy users is on establishing private contracts with renewables, which shatters the economics of discoms and so on. So it's a second pathway for change. And the third pathway for change is the fact that electricity is a subnational subject. Electricity is a state subject. For Tamil Nadu to be a destination of investment and for Tamil Nadu to be a source of exports, they will need to reform the electricity sector. They will need to create conditions where private renewables generators are able to sell to private exporting companies. And that will drive the discom reforms. The self-interest of states in the league tables of the CMIE CapEx investment will reshape electricity policy in the state. These are the 3 political forces that are at work.
Thank you, Ajay. I think this whole point on the subnational is super important. I think there's a reference to the Finance Commission, which, the next Finance Commission, I think, will have to play a critical role in shaping some of these policies if we are serious about this issue. So Montek, 1 minute for you, and then I'll turn to Amrita for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Deepak. Well, let me thank everybody, those who have commented, the panelists. It's been a very interesting discussion. I've certainly myself learned a lot from it, a complex area. I just want to make a comment agreeing with Ajay on electricity. We talked about defining a national strategy. I think in the paper we have said the one area where things lie entirely in the realm of the state government, so it doesn't have to be done by the national government, is to privatize distribution. For the last 10 years, I've been recommending it at every chance we get. Now, it may not seem to people that this is connected with climate change. And I fear that almost none of the NGOs in the country who generally get excited about climate change will actually support this recommendation either. But I completely agree with what Ajay said. If the government or any political party has the capacity to persuade a state government, this won't become a national issue, because it's difficult for the national government to do something which belongs to the state government. Frankly, if there's any state that actually wants to give a signal to the rest of the world that it is serious, both in setting its fiscal house in order and in setting its energy system in order, they should simply adopt a policy of privatizing the distribution system. The best way of doing that would be to identify the three major sort of urban areas in the country, leave the rural part to the state, because I don't think the private fellows would be interested. Privatize those distribution companies, get some of the revenue from them to subsidize rural distribution, which will be needed, and linked with the privatization of a bulk of the urban distribution, completely modernize the regulatory system. That means not running it through retired civil servants just come out of the power ministry, but build a core of professionals. And frankly, there's a lot of talk about capacity. And it's certainly true that there are many states where capacity is very poor. Although, you know, on the other hand, when we really want to get something done, we seem to be able to do it. I can't see any reason why, let's say, 3 of the states that have the most ambitions to become the sort of test cases for successful broad policy in the future cannot consider privatizing distribution. It'll have the biggest bang for the buck in multiple areas of productivity, efficiency, energy use, etc., etc.
Thank you, Montek. I think you ended the discussion in a way that perhaps might be a segue for our next webinar that Ajay and we were talking about before we started this discussion. But thank you very much. I think this was a wonderful, energetic, very informative discussion. I can't thank you all, Montek, Manjeev, and Ajay and Utkarsh for this. Let me now turn to Amrita Goldar, who is a senior fellow and the thematic leader for the climate change, urbanization, and sustainability work at ICRIER. I'm not going to give her elaborate CV because of lack of time, but she's one of our most terrific, prolific researcher in ICRIER, and I'm delighted to give Amrita the last word. Over to you, Amrita.
Thank you so much, sir. So definitely I can't say that I would be the last word, because a lot of complex issues were brought to the fore in the discussions today. But yes, I have taken copious notes. So I was writing as the speakers were speaking, and I have tried to summarize some of the discussion points that was raised today. So before I move on to the notes, I would like to thank all the speakers and the panelists. So something that I found very commendable was the fact that how seamlessly speakers zoomed in onto subnational issues, and then at the next very minute zoomed out into the global negotiation space. So that was done very nicely. So let me just take you to the notes that I've written. So as the research fraternity, we are all looking at the Glasgow negotiations with both a sense of urgency as well as eager anticipation. So this paper written by Montek sir and Utkarsh comes as a very opportune time. So something that I felt was that while there was a disagreement, I would say, between both panelists as well as probably general literature on should our aim be deep decarbonization, net zero, or even net negative, or what our final timeline should be, 2050 or beyond. But there was a general agreement on the sectors that were of importance and on the strategies that would take us to the final objective. In the paper and also the presentation, Montek sir and Utkarsh talked about how net zero trajectories were clearly unfair for developing countries who would now have lesser room to grow. And a very interesting point made by Montek sir was the fact that we are slowly and steadily breaking away from the traditional approach, and that development need not necessarily equal to emissions. So that is a very interesting point, and maybe the Kaya identity that we take as the gospel truth need not hold any longer. Something that was stated again and again was the fact that structural changes are required. So we had a discussion on coal, we had a discussion about power distribution. We had a very interesting point made by Ambassador Puri that despite our best efforts, we might not achieve what we want, and maybe a substantial move towards either afforestation or CCUS would be required. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. And this very interesting point made by Montek sir about the importance of carbon pricing in the near future. So that is something that probably researchers like us need to keep in mind and need to maybe think about optical trajectories of how this could come about. The other point that was made was regarding the fact that till recently, the argument of our subsidies came from this argument of cost effectiveness. But instead, what the authors felt was there was a need to move towards removal of market failures like fossil fuel subsidies, and these need to be done first, and then later the other issues need to be addressed. Something that all speakers talked about was the need for a lot of investments, and Ambassador Puri quoted a TERI study saying that maybe even if we discount 3% of cumulative GDP would be the cost that it would come to. So would it come from public sources or private sources? Most probably, with some coming from bilateral and multilateral funding. But the fact remains that we probably can't just keep waiting for the 100 billions to magically arrive someday. And a point that was made by Professor Shah was the fact that a lot of resources would need to be mobilized at a subnational level. And two new funding sources that are gaining prominence are the ESG financial flows as well as climate philanthropy. So when we are drawing up the blueprint about our financing needs for the climate trajectory, we need to take cognizance of these additional financial flows as well. Something that we could not probably get sort of consensus on was this, the need for India to put forth credible trajectory towards global compact, and some words of caution were stated by both Ambassador Puri as well as Professor Shah. So I think what we sort of agreed to disagree, and the last word was that we need to probably think strategically and from scratch. So India is wedded to multilateralism, and we probably don't have an option of reneging later. So we need to think before we move. An interesting point that was made by Professor Shah was regarding India's opportunity as a developing country and a latecomer. So it obviously gets the benefits of technology leapfrogging, but also from the negotiation strategy as well as domestic action. There are, I would say, gains that could be reaped, but capacity building at multiple levels are going to be critical. So the last point I would want to make is that I have personally read the working paper written by Montek sir and Utkarsh, and it makes for a very engaging read. And it lays out a very comprehensive lay of the land and what are the key issues, what strategies need to be followed. So I would encourage all budding researchers who want to get into the climate change space. So I would encourage them to read it whenever possible. And as they say, devil's in the details. So I would suggest that authors think about converting this paper into probably a policy series where each of these sort of smaller issues, maybe coal, maybe forestry, other things, can be discussed in each detail in each of these policy issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amrita.
Sorry, sir. I'll let one last word in. Sorry, my mistake. So since I have to propose a word of thanks as well, so let me take this opportunity of thanking all the panelists, Montek sir, Utkarsh, Professor Shah, Ambassador Puri. Also, congratulations to the events team led by Manjeev ji, Neha, Rajkumar, and Rajesh. Thanks to the research team that helped with the event planning as well, Tarun and Dia. And lastly, Deepak sir himself, our director, for anchoring both the event as well as the pre-event preparations. Over to you, sir.
Let's keep that the last word. Thank you very much.